Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said she just wasn't in the mood lately. Not tired, not stressed, just not there. I told myself moods pass, connection doesn't. I said it calmly, like something learned over years of keeping promises and schedules aligned. Her face didn't argue. It froze for half a second. That was the moment I understood she would only get it later. The night it cracked open wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No plates. It was a company mixer held in a rented space off the interstate. One of those places that smells like new paint and bad coffee. I stood with a plastic cup in my hand, listening to my own employees talk logistics like it was weather. My wife, Emily, was 10 feet away, HR smile on, posture perfect, controlling distance the way she always did. And next to her stood Ryan, my operations manager. My right hand. The guy who knew every route, every weakness, every workaround I trusted him with. They weren't touching. That was the part that fooled everyone else. But I saw timing instead. How she laughed a beat earlier with him. How her body angled without thinking. With me, she had been saying not tonight for months. With him, she was already present. On the drive home, the silence felt rehearsed. She scrolled on her iPhone, thumb moving fast, face neutral. I watched the road and thought about how many Sundays I used to spend at Sam's Club loading the cart with things she liked, thinking that was care. I realized she hadn't noticed I stopped. At home, she mentioned being exhausted. Work had been a lot. Ryan's name slipped into the sentence like a typo. I didn't react. I put my keys down slowly. I noticed how quiet the house sounded without tension, like something already emptied out. Later that night, I sat alone in the garage, the Tesla still warm, its silence almost polite. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. What I felt was a click, like a system switching modes. The part of me that kept reaching went offline. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions I didn't need answered. I went to bed knowing something else instead. Intimacy hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected. And whatever comes next always starts before anyone admits it out loud. The next morning, nothing looked different, which was how I knew it already was. Emily moved through the kitchen on routine, coffee measured, tone neutral, like we were co-workers sharing a break room instead of a marriage. She asked about shipments, not sleep. About deadlines, not distance. I answered in the same efficient rhythm. That was the first shift. I stopped filling the silence. At the office, Ryan was early. He always was. He handed me a report without meeting my eyes for long. Too quick. Too careful. I didn't accuse him in my head. I didn't need to. What caught my attention was how relaxed he looked for someone carrying so much access. Confidence without consequence is never accidental. I spent the day watching patterns instead of people. Who lingered after meetings? Who synced their schedules? How often Emily's office door stayed closed when Ryan was running numbers with her? It wasn't sex that stood out. It was coordination. Intimacy wears many uniforms, and this one looked like teamwork. That night, I didn't come home right away. I pulled into a McDonald's parking lot and ate alone in the car, engine off, wrapper folded neatly on the seat beside me. It wasn't comfort food. It was efficiency, fuel without conversation. I realized how much of my life had been spent trying to earn closeness instead of noticing when it had already been reassigned. At home, she talked about a renovation idea she'd seen online. Something about updating the back room, finally finishing what we started. She mentioned Lowe's like it was a plan already in motion. I nodded once and said nothing. I could see the future she was still assuming I'd show up for. That was the moment I decided not to correct her. I slept lightly, not from worry, but from clarity. The marriage wasn't collapsing. It was being managed around me. And that was worse, because management implies intent. The next day, I started doing something new. I stopped solving problems that weren't mine to carry alone. I delegated calls I'd always taken personally. I left meetings early, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed later. Emily didn't comment. Ryan adjusted quickly. That told me everything. They had already practiced operating without me. I was just late to notice. I didn't go looking for proof the way desperate men do. No late-night phone grabs. No passwords guessed out of spite. I waited. People who think they're safe get sloppy when no one reacts. It started with calendars. Shared ones. Meetings that used to include me suddenly didn't. Operational sync showed up twice a week, always late, always optional. I watched how often those blocks moved together. Not canceled. Shifted, like two magnets adjusting without touching. Then there were expenses. Not the obvious kind. No hotels. No gifts. Just small overlaps. Dinners billed as client meetings. Rides reimbursed twice. It wasn't fraud. It was familiarity. The kind that assumes no one is auditing intent. At home, Emily moved lighter, almost relieved. She stopped pretending to initiate closeness. She didn't reject me anymore because I stopped asking. That unsettled her more than arguments ever would have. Distance is manageable when someone keeps reaching. When they don't, it turns into a mirror. One evening, she mentioned a bracelet she'd seen online. Not asked for, just mentioned. Something subtle. Silver. Minimal. I nodded and said nothing. A few days later, a small box from Pandora arrived anyway, addressed to her, placed carefully on the kitchen counter. She didn't open it in front of me. She waited until I was in the shower. That told me who it wasn't from. I didn't confront her. I adjusted my posture in the marriage instead. I stopped sharing my day. I stopped narrating my thoughts. I kept my tone even and my answers short. I noticed how often she checked her phone when the house went quiet, rereading messages that weren't arriving anymore. At work, I pulled myself out of operations inch by inch. Gave Ryan authority without presence. It felt like trust to him. It was distance to me. When you want to see how something runs, you stop touching it. The shift didn't cause panic right away. That came later. First came confusion. Emily asked if I was tired, if something was wrong. I said work was changing, which was true. I wasn't collecting evidence to destroy them. I was watching momentum, and momentum was already carrying me somewhere else. Away from explanations, away from negotiation, toward a version of myself that didn't need to be chosen to stay. I didn't disappear in the way people expect. No bags packed, no doors slammed. I stayed visible while quietly removing weight. That's the difference between absence and withdrawal. One alarms, the other destabilizes. The first thing I stopped doing was shopping for a future that assumed us. Sundays used to mean bulk runs, predictable aisles, family-sized intentions. I didn't announce that I skipped Sam's club. I just didn't come back with anything anymore. When she opened the pantry and noticed gaps, she paused longer than necessary, like the shelves had said something she didn't want to hear. At work, I changed my calendar. Not dramatically. I moved myself out of recurring meetings and replaced them with one-on-ones that ended early. I let Ryan run point without my shadow. I watched how fast he filled the space, how comfortable he became when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Power always reveals itself when supervision loosens. At home, Emily suggested revisiting the house projects we'd stalled on. The back room, the shelves, the half-finished plans. She mentioned Lowe's again, like repetition could restart momentum. I told her we'd talk about it later. Later became undefined. Undefined became heavy. I started coming home later. Not to punish, to recalibrate. I'd eat alone, sometimes in the car, sometimes not at all. Silence became a habit instead of a response. When she asked if everything was okay, I said yes without elaboration. That unsettled her more than a fight would have. She began watching me instead of her phone, tracking my exits, noticing my posture. I felt it when I moved past her without explanation, when I didn't ask where she'd been, when I didn't check in. Attention is currency. I stopped spending it. One night, I stayed parked longer than usual, the car cooling in the dark. No music, no calls, just space. I realized I wasn't waiting to catch them. I was letting them run uninterrupted. Systems show their flaws when left alone. Inside the house, she sat on the couch scrolling her iPhone, rereading threads that no longer updated. I passed through the room like a guest. She looked up, about to speak, then stopped herself. That hesitation was new. I hadn't left the marriage yet, but my center of gravity had moved. And when that happens, everything else eventually tips. Ryan started making small mistakes once I stepped back. Not operational failures. Judgment ones. The kind that come from thinking the system runs because of you, not around you. He approved overtime too fast. Promised timelines without buffer. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough pressure to expose habits. I didn't correct him publicly. I let the numbers speak. I forwarded questions instead of answering them. Let clients hear his voice without my correction layered underneath. Confidence without containment always drifts. Emily noticed the shift before anyone else. She started asking about work in a different tone. Less curiosity, more calibration. She wanted to know where I was placing my attention. I gave her neutral answers. No reassurance. No complaints. Just facts. One evening, I drove straight from a late meeting to McDonald's, ordered the same thing I always did, and ate in the car with the lights off. It wasn't about hunger. It was about choosing a space where nothing was expected of me. No performance. No emotional labor. Just quiet. At home, the house felt paused. She'd lit a lamp but left the room unfinished, like she'd been waiting for me to return and complete it. On the counter sat the unopened bracelet box, the one from Pandora. It hadn't moved in days. That told me something had shifted between them two. Gifts mean intention. Intention leaves fingerprints. At the office, I authorized an internal review. Routine. Annual. No accusations. Just process. Ryan volunteered to handle it. I let him. The report came back clean on paper and strained between the lines. Overlapping decisions. Blurred boundaries. Nothing illegal. Just unsustainable. Emily stopped mentioning him at home. That absence was louder than any name drop. She watched me more closely instead. Studied my exits. Counted the hours I wasn't reachable. I didn't expose anything. I didn't confront either of them. I just removed friction from their momentum. Made them visible without spotlight. When systems operate without resistance, they eventually reveal where they were relying on silence. By the end of the week, Ryan looked tired. Emily looked uncertain. And I felt something else entirely. Not satisfaction. Alignment. I wasn't pushing them apart. I was stepping out of the triangle. And without me stabilizing it, everything else had to find its own balance. The first real shift didn't happen at home or in the office. It happened in a room full of people who weren't supposed to notice anything at all. It was a quarterly partner meeting. Not dramatic. Folding chairs, bottled water, polite applause. I took a seat near the back instead of the front. That alone drew looks. People are used to seeing patterns, and when you break one quietly, it registers as absence before it's understood as choice. Emily entered late and scanned the room without realizing she was looking for me. When she found me sitting apart, something tightened in her posture. Control depends on proximity. Distance introduces variables. Ryan spoke confidently at first. He always did when the structure felt familiar. But as questions layered, his answers stretched thinner. He referenced decisions I no longer backed, processes I'd already stepped away from. For the first time, the room saw him without my alignment behind him. Not exposed, just unsupported. No one accused anyone of anything. That's the part people misunderstand. Social pressure doesn't require confrontation. It requires recognition. A pause too long after an answer. A glance exchanged. Someone finally saying they'd follow up later. Emily didn't look at Ryan after that. She looked at me. Not for rescue. For orientation. I stayed still. Later, at home, she sat scrolling through her iPhone, rereading messages that weren't refreshing. I passed through the kitchen without stopping. She asked if something had gone wrong at the meeting. I said it went as expected, which was true. The next day, she skipped lunch with coworkers and came home early. She walked through the house like she was checking for stability. Opened cabinets. Noticed the projects that weren't moving forward. The back room still unfinished. The plans that required both of us stalled in place. She mentioned family coming by soon. Asked if we should prepare. I said we could talk about it later. Later had become a wall she couldn't see through. At work, Ryan started closing his office door. Emily kept hers open. That inversion didn't go unnoticed. Someone made a comment in passing. Not accusatory. Curious. Curiosity is dangerous when narratives are thin. I didn't step in to correct perceptions. I didn't clarify roles. I let silence do the explaining. By the end of the week, Emily wasn't losing reputation. She was losing footing. And the difference matters. Reputation can be defended. Footing has to be rebuilt. I stayed calm, present, untethered. And for the first time, she realized the distance wasn't temporary. It was directional. Isolation doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in when the usual anchors stop responding. Emily felt it before she understood it. I could see it in the way she moved through the house, slower, like she was listening for something that used to answer back. She started asking questions that weren't really questions. If I was planning to be home for dinner. If I wanted anything from the store. If we should schedule time together. I answered each one politely and without commitment. Not dismissive. Just unavailable. Availability is what she had misjudged for permanence. One evening she mentioned stopping by Sam's Club after work. Asked if we needed anything. I told her I'd already eaten. That was true. I'd grabbed something quick and sat alone again, not out of sadness, but because it required nothing from me. When she came back with bags anyway, she realized she'd bought for a version of us that wasn't showing up anymore. At night, she stayed awake longer. I could feel it even when I didn't turn toward her. The glow of her iPhone would pulse, then dim, then pulse again. She was rereading conversations, searching for tone shifts, timestamps, meaning. There were no new messages coming from me, and that absence finally outweighed everything she thought she'd gained elsewhere. At work, she started hovering, asking questions outside her role, checking on things that had never concerned her before. People noticed. HR works best when it's invisible. When it becomes visible, it's usually because someone is looking for leverage or reassurance. Ryan stopped being a refuge. Pressure does that. He had enough of his own now. Their alignment fractured quietly, not from exposure, but from stress. Intimacy that thrives in secrecy rarely survives daylight and deadlines. She tried to reconnect through memory, brought up trips we'd taken, plans we'd postponed. She mentioned the bracelet again, still untouched, still sitting where it had been left. I didn't comment. Gifts lose their power when timing is off. I remained present but unreachable. Ate when I wanted, left when I needed to. I wasn't punishing her. I was no longer orienting myself around her responses. The isolation tightened, not because I withdrew affection, but because I withdrew dependence. And that's the part no one prepares for. When someone realizes too late that what they thought was distance was actually trust being spent down to zero. She hadn't lost me yet, but she had lost access. And access is what she'd built her sense of control on all along. The confrontation didn't come with raised voices or demands. It arrived the way everything else had lately. Carefully, late, and already off balance. She waited until the house was quiet, until the space between us felt intentional. I could tell she'd rehearsed it. Her posture was controlled, her tone measured, like an HR conversation that pretends to be personal. She asked if I was pulling away. Not accused. Asked, as if the answer might still be negotiable. I didn't rush to fill the space. Silence has a way of pulling truth out of people when they're not ready. She kept going. Said she felt us drifting. Said work had been stressful. Said she missed how things used to be. None of it landed where she expected. She wanted reassurance. A timeline. Something to react to. I gave her none of that. I told her I'd noticed the distance too. That I wasn't confused about it anymore. That was all. Her control slipped for a second then. Just enough to show. She asked if there was someone else. The irony didn't escape me. I shook my head once. No explanation. No defense. The truth didn't need detail. She reached for her phone instinctively, then stopped herself. I could see the reflex. The habit of checking, confirming, stabilizing through a screen. Her iPhone lit up and went dark again. No new messages. No interruptions. Just the room and the realization that this conversation wasn't steering anything. She asked what I wanted. That was the first honest question. I told her I was already living the answer. That landed heavier than anything else I could have said. She tried to bring Ryan up indirectly. Mentioned how work dynamics had changed. How the company felt different. I didn't respond. My silence wasn't avoidance. It was boundary. What she didn't understand yet was that I wasn't deciding in that moment. I'd already moved. Emotionally first. Structurally second. The words were just catching up. She looked at me like she was seeing someone unfamiliar. Not angry. Not cold. Just unreachable. That's when her composure finally cracked. Not into tears. Into fear. I didn't leave the room. I didn't comfort her either. I stayed where I was, steady, detached, present. And in that stillness, she realized the truth she'd been avoiding. I hadn't withdrawn to be chased. I had stepped out because I no longer needed to be chosen. The collapse didn't announce itself. It unfolded in quiet fragments, each one small enough to dismiss until there was nothing left to hold on to. Ryan was the first thing to slip fully out of her grasp. Pressure finished what secrecy had started. His authority narrowed. Decisions were rerouted. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors moved into rooms with glass walls. He didn't get fired. That would have been simple. He was contained. And containment feels like suffocation to people who confuse access with power. Emily felt it immediately. Her position hadn't changed on paper, but her influence had. People stopped checking in. Stopped asking. HR without leverage becomes ceremonial. She came home earlier some nights, not because she was done, but because there was nowhere left to assert herself. She tried to anchor through routine, asked if we should finally go to Lowe's and finish the house. Said the words carefully, like an offering. I told her the timing didn't feel right. Not unkind, just final. The project stayed unfinished. Symbols have weight when they stop moving forward. The house grew quieter, not tense, empty. She started leaving lights on in rooms she wasn't using. Sound where there was none. I'd come in late, sometimes after grabbing something quick and eating alone, and find her sitting still, phone in her hand, scrolling without purpose. Her iPhone had become a mirror instead of a bridge. She reread our old messages, looking for a moment she could point to and say that's when it changed. She didn't understand that it had changed long before words stopped. She tried memory next. Brought up the bracelet again, still in its box, untouched. Said it meant something once. I didn't disagree. I just didn't engage. Meaning expires when it's delayed too long. The social part came last. Friends stopped inviting her the way they used to. Not deliberately, just gradually. People follow energy, and hers had shifted. She wasn't disgraced. She was destabilized. That's harder to explain and harder to fix. I watched all of it without satisfaction. That surprised me most. There was no triumph in seeing someone realize too late that they'd misjudged the cost of distance. Just confirmation. By the time she understood what she'd lost, I was already living without it. And the silence she used to control had become the space I finally owned. The last moment wasn't loud. It didn't come with tears or ultimatums. It arrived as a pause that stretched longer than she expected and never resolved itself. She waited until I was putting my keys down, until the house felt small enough to contain what she needed to say. Her composure was gone then, not replaced by drama, but by something rawer. Honesty without strategy. She told me she finally understood what had happened. Not the details. The consequence. She said she should have taken the distance seriously when it first appeared. That she mistook stability for something that would wait. I listened without interrupting. Not because I owed her closure, but because it was the first time she wasn't managing the conversation. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was acknowledging loss. She said she felt like she'd woken up in a life where everything important had already moved on. Work, marriage, even herself. She mentioned the bracelet one last time, still sitting unopened, like proof that intention doesn't matter when timing is gone. I didn't look at it. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. The words didn't land as an accusation. They landed as a summary. Clean. Final. She asked if there was any chance left. Not to fix things. To rebuild something different. I didn't answer right away. I told her that whatever came next would happen on new terms, not out of fear of being alone, but out of mutual presence. That silence had already done its work. If there was to be anything after it, it wouldn't look like what we'd lost. I picked up my keys and walked out to the driveway. The Tesla waited, quiet, unchanged, ready. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate either. Movement didn't feel like escape. It felt like alignment. As I drove off, I didn't look back at the house. Not because it didn't matter, but because I no longer needed to confirm anything behind me. She stood in that pause long after the sound was gone, finally understanding what else she'd lost when intimacy became optional. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I left because I'd already learned mine. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.